Because if you don't, you're dead.
My strength was unbending when it came to accepting that BS.
I'm a rookie in a new career, a very glamorous career.
Jim Brown was never supposed to exist. Not in the era he was born into. Not in the sports systems that tried to contain him. And certainly not in the industries that expected him to stay in his place. Before he became an NFL legend, before Hollywood ever called his name, before his image stood at the center of American culture, Jim Brown was a problem the world did not know how to solve. James Nathaniel Brown was born on February 17, 1936, on St. Simon's Island, Georgia. For a black child in the American South at that time, opportunity was limited, fragile, and easily taken away. His early life was shaped by absence. His father left when Jim was still young. His mother, determined that her son would have more options than she did, eventually sent him north to Long Island, New York to live with relatives. Jim Brown arrived with no safety net, no privilege, and quickly became clear that Jim Brown was not a single sport athlete. He dominated football, he excelled in basketball, he ran track. And in lacrosse, a sport few people expected a black teenager to redefine, he changed everything. At Syracuse University, Jim Brown became something rare, an athlete who did not simply play the game, but overwhelmed it. As a midfielder in lacrosse, a position requiring endurance, speed, and constant physical contact, Brown was unstoppable. He was stronger than defenders who tried to contain him, faster than those who tried to outrun him, and more aggressive than anyone prepared for his style of play. His dominance was so complete that the sport itself had to take notice. Years later, lacrosse would formally recognize this reality by naming its top midfielder honor the Jim Brown Award. Not as nostalgia, but as an admission. The standard begins with him, and this was only the beginning. Physically, Jim Brown did not fit expectations. At roughly 6'2" and more than 230 pounds, he had the size of a lineman. Yet he moved with speed, balance, and coordination, rarely seen in someone of that build. Coaches and scouts struggled to explain what they were witnessing. Brown trained differently from most athletes of his era. He focused on balance. 7 as a member of the Cleveland Browns. He stepped into one of the most physically punishing eras in those conditions, enduring him. What makes Jim Brown's career extraordinary is not longevity, but he redefined the running back position. He led the league in rushing 8 times. He won 3 NFL Most Valuable Player awards. He averaged that has never been matched. These were not several more years. In the Dirty Dozen, it was not a novelty role. Brown was part of the film's core ensemble, standing alongside established stars. Professional football was nothing like the modern game fans recognize today. There were no concussion protocols, no keenly struck late. Grouch. He ran straight through violence, never around it. Former defenders later described facing Jim Brown as an endurance test rather than a matchup. Tackling him meant bracing for pain. Every carry came with consequences. The league had no answers. Statistically, Jim Brown's dominance remains unmatched. Across 9 seasons, from 1957 to 1965, he averaged over 100 rushing yards per game. Brown led the entire league in rushing and won Rookie of the Year. There was no learning curve, no gradual rise. From his first snap, he was the best at his position. Even more striking was how efficient he was. His career average of more than 5 yards inflicted damage. By the mid-1960s, Jim Brown was still at the top of the sport. He showed no decline. No major injuries had slowed him. He had just won another MVP award and remained the focal point of the Cleveland Browns offense. By every traditional standard, his career should have continued for several more seasons. But Jim Brown did not view football the way the league did. To the NFL, players were assets. Careers ended when bodies failed. Players were not expected to control their exits. Retirement was something that happened after usefulness faded. Jim Brown rejected that structure. While still at his peak, Hollywood had begun to take notice. His presence, discipline, and intelligence made him stand out in a film industry that was beginning to search for new kinds of leading men. In 1968, abroad for several months. During filming, the Cleveland Browns demanded his immediate return for training camp. The message was clear: football came first. Other ambitions were secondary. Jim Brown did not comply. Most dominant running back in professional football, Jim Brown, for a player voluntarily leaving at that level of dominance. The NFL had no mechanism to stop him, no leverage to force him back. For the first time, a professional athlete had prioritized ownership of his future over the demands of the sport. When his film was released the following year, it became a major success. Jim Brown was no longer just a football legend. He had successfully transitioned into a new career without asking permission. This moment redefined what was possible for athletes. Jim Brown proved that players did not have to sacrifice their bodies indefinitely for the sake of tradition. He demonstrated that power did not belong exclusively to leagues or owners. It could belong to the individual, if that individual was willing to walk away. By leaving when he did, Jim Brown preserved his physical health, protected his legacy, and established a new model of autonomy that protections were introduced. But those changes came after years of damage. Jim Brown did not benefit from that evolution. He dominated before the league learned restraint. And then, when he had nothing left to prove, he chose far beyond sports. When Jim Brown walked away from the NFL in 1966, he didn't leave as a fading star. He left as the most dominant running back the league had ever seen. He was still at the top. No decline, no injury forcing his hand. That choice alone rewrote the rules of professional sports. But what came next would prove that football was only one chapter in a much larger, more complicated life. Hollywood had been watching Jim Brown for years. His presence was impossible to ignore. Tall, powerful, disciplined, and commanding without trying. In an industry that had long confined black men to limited, submissive roles, Brown represented something different. Director Robert Aldrich cast him in The Dirty Dozen, 1967, not as a novelty athlete cameo, but as a core member of the ensemble alongside major stars of the era. Filming took place in London and stretched for months. During production, the Cleveland Browns issued an ultimatum: return immediately for training camp or face financial penalties and potential suspension. For most players of that era, the decision would have been automatic. Teams controlled careers, contracts were leveraged, obedience was expected. Jim Brown chose differently. From London, he announced his retirement at age 30. Still the best in the world. The NFL was stunned. There was no precedent for a player leaving voluntarily at that level. But Brown understood something critical. If he returned, football would own the rest of his life. If he stayed, he controlled his future. When The Dirty Dozen premiered, it became one of the highest grossing films of the decade. Jim Brown was no longer just an athlete who tried acting. He was a legitimate Hollywood star. What made Brown's film career different wasn't just success, it was boundaries. He refused roles that portrayed black men as weak, subordinate, or morally diminished for the comfort of others. That stance was radical at the time. Hollywood was still deeply shaped by racial hierarchy, and black actors were often expected to accept whatever parts were offered. Jim Brown did not. He chose 1968, 100 Rifles, 1969, and later Slaughter, 1972, and Slaughter's Big Ripoff, 1973, placed him at the center of action-driven narratives. He wasn't comic relief. He wasn't a sidekick. He wasn't there to soften himself. Equally important, Brown understood business. He negotiated contracts like a star, not like an athlete grateful for permission. He demanded pay that reflected his box office draw. In an era when black performers were routinely underpaid, this alone shifted expectations. His presence opened doors. After Jim Brown, Hollywood could no longer pretend black athletes belonged only in background roles. A new generation followed. Men like Carl Weathers, Fred Williamson, and others entering an industry that had been forced to change its assumptions. But Jim Brown's life wasn't confined to sports or film. His departure from the NFL also marked a deeper shift. He became increasingly engaged in social activism. In 1967, he organized what became known as the Cleveland Summit, a historic gathering of prominent black athletes and leaders. The meeting took place during a volatile moment in American history. Muhammad Ali had been stripped of his heavyweight title and faced prison for refusing military service during the Vietnam War. The country was divided. Many public figures together influential voices, including Bill Russell and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, to publicly support Ali after questioning him directly about his stance. The group emerged united, announcing their support in a move that challenged both the sports establishment and the federal government. It was a turning point. Athletes were no longer just entertainers. They were political actors with voices that mattered. Jim Brown helped make that visible, ownership, opportunity, and self-determination within black communities. He spoke openly about inequality in professional sports, especially the gap between the number of black athletes generating profit and the lack of black leadership in management and ownership roles. But while Jim Brown was reshaping public perception, his private life was far more complicated. Hollywood in the late 1960s and 1970s was a world of excess in how he was perceived. The image of the disciplined icon began to fracture. What's important to understand is that Jim Brown's public power and private struggles existed at the same time. He was capable of discipline on the field and intensity off it. Leadership and conflict came fully into view. Legal issues led to court involvement, and Brown faced consequences that marked a turning point in his public life. He stepped away from Hollywood almost entirely. Offers disappeared. Silence replaced headlines. The man who once refused to be controlled now faced a different reality: accountability without applause. Yet even as his presence faded from screens, his influence did not disappear. Documentaries revisited his life, conversations became more nuanced. He was no longer framed as a flawless hero or a simple villain, but as something more complex. Jim Brown was a man who broke systems, and in doing so, revealed both their limits and his own. And as his later years approached, the question was no longer about dominance or fame, but about how history would hold someone who changed so much and struggled just as visibly in the process. By the time, repeatedly emphasized that while black athletes filled stadiums and generated enormous profits, they were still excluded from the highest levels of decision-making. This belief led him to continue expanding initiatives aimed at community empowerment. One of his most notable efforts was the development of programs designed to support young men in marginalized communities, especially those vulnerable to violence and incarceration. Brown believed that discipline, structure, and this work was not charity, it was responsibility. Yet even as he worked to uplift others, Brown's personal life continued to draw scrutiny. Over the decades, his name became associated with legal disputes, volatile relationships, and repeated allegations that complicated how the public viewed him. While many of these incidents never resulted in long-term convictions, they nonetheless became part of the public record and, over time, part of his narrative. Brown himself rarely offered detailed public reflections on these moments, choosing instead to speak broadly about accountability, personal growth, and the consequences of unchecked anger. In the late 1990s, one highly publicized legal case marked a turning point. Brown faced consequences not for a violent crime, but for refusing to comply with a court-ordered anger management that followed him for decades. For others, own code, even when it came at a personal cost. Either way, the incident permanently altered how his legacy would be discussed. No longer could his story be told without acknowledging both achievement and consequence. As the years passed, Brown gradually withdrew from public life. He made with his family in Los Angeles. His final years were quieter, marked less balanced portrayals of his life. The film did not attempt to sanitize his story, nor did it reduce seven. His death prompted a wave of reflection across sports, film, and civil rights communities. It is the truth of Jim Brown's legacy. It resists simplicity. He was not just a football player. He was not just an actor. He was not just an activist. Jim Brown was a force, one that changed systems, challenged expectations, and exposed the uncomfortable reality that power, brilliance, and personal struggle can exist in the same life. History rarely offers clean heroes. It offers people. Jim Brown belongs to that category. His impact on sports, culture, and representation is undeniable. So are the contradictions that followed him. To study his life is not to choose admiration or condemnation, but to confront the full weight of what it means to live without compromise in a world to history, where influence, conflict, courage, and consequence stand side by side. If you found this story thought-provoking, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your perspective in the comments. Which part of Jim Brown's legacy stands out to you the most? The athlete, the activist, or the complexity of the man himself?